Nobody talks about the third floor of Buckingham Palace. Not really. The tourists don't go there. The official tours skip it. Even the younger staff, the ones who haven't been there long enough to learn which silences matter, they figure out within a week or two that the third floor has its own weather system, its own atmosphere. Something heavier than the rest of the building, like the air never fully circulates up there, like it holds things. Margaret Howell had worked at the palace for 19 years. She knew. She was a senior textile conservator, which was a title that sounded important at dinner parties and meant almost nothing to anyone outside a very specific world of acid-free tissue paper and humidity-controlled cabinets. What it actually meant, day to day, was that Margaret was one of 3 people in the entire institution trusted with the preservation of the most significant garments in the royal collection. She'd handled coronation robes, christening gowns going back 2 centuries, military uniforms with bullet holes still in them. But the third floor's east corridor, that was a different kind of weight entirely. That was where her things were kept. Queen Elizabeth II had been gone almost 3 years now. 3 years, and still nobody on the senior staff said her name casually. It came out reverent, or it didn't come out at all. She was referred to in documentation as the late sovereign. In hushed corridor conversation, she was sometimes just her, as if there was only ever one her, and always would be. The dress had been catalogued under reference number TRC 1947 WD 001. Margaret knew every fiber of it. Norman Hartnell's masterpiece, 10,000 seed pearls. The train that had nearly bankrupted a post-war rationing budget. The gown that a 21-year-old princess had walked down the aisle in at Westminster Abbey on November 20th, 1947, while a nation that had just survived something unsurvivable pressed itself against wireless sets and tried to remember what joy felt like. It had been Margaret's responsibility for 11 years. She kept the storage room at 61 degrees Fahrenheit and 45% relative humidity. She turned the dress twice a year to prevent fiber stress. She documented everything. Every inspection, every measurement, every microscopic variance in the embroidery threads. So when she arrived on a Tuesday morning in early March and found the storage room door slightly, just slightly, ajar, something in her chest went very still. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The door was ajar. She had locked it herself on Friday. She remembered specifically because she'd noticed a small anomaly in the lower left panel's lining and had made a note to follow up Monday, which she had, and she had locked it again Monday evening at 6:43. She pushed the door open. The environmental monitor on the wall read 64 degrees. 3 degrees off. 3 degrees didn't sound like much. In textile conservation terms, it was the difference between stability and accelerated deterioration. In Margaret's professional universe, it was roughly equivalent to finding a window open in a room where someone had been sleeping. She crossed to the climate control panel and checked the log. Override code entered at 9:17 p.m. on Monday. Staff ID, C, Royal 001. Margaret stood very still for the second time in as many minutes. C, Royal 001 was not a staff code. She found out by 11 a.m. She didn't want to find out. She spent 2 hours checking and rechecking, hoping the log had corrupted, hoping there was an explanation that involved a technical glitch and a staff member who'd transposed their ID numbers. She called IT. She called facilities management. She pulled 2 years of environmental logs to compare. There was no glitch. C, Royal 001 was a designation that bypassed standard staff clearance protocols entirely. It appeared in the system's administrative architecture in exactly one place, as an override assigned to access granted directly by royal household authorization at the most senior level. It was, in the bureaucratic language of palace infrastructure, a member of the immediate royal family. The dress had been accessed at 9:17 p.m. on a Monday, outside of any logged maintenance schedule, without informing the conservation office, with a climate override that had pushed the storage environment 3 degrees above Margaret's preservation parameters. She sat at her desk for a very long time. Then, she picked up her phone and called Daniel Ashworth. Daniel Ashworth was head of ceremonial collections, which meant he was Margaret's supervisor's supervisor, and he was a man who had navigated 3 decades of palace politics by developing a finely calibrated internal compass for when to act and when to make himself professionally invisible. He called her back in 40 minutes. She told him what she'd found. He was quiet for a moment. "Leave the report on my desk," he said. "Don't file it through the standard system yet." "Daniel, the climate irregularity needs to be documented. I know. Leave it on my desk." She did. She didn't hear back from him until Thursday. When she did, it was not a phone call. It was a brief, internal memo, formal language, institutional tone, the kind of communication that said everything by saying almost nothing. A request had been received from the household of Their Majesties the King and Queen Consort to view TRC 1947 WE-001 for personal and ceremonial consultation purposes. Access had been appropriately authorized at the highest level. The Conservation Office was thanked for its diligence and reminded that all household access requests at this clearance level are classified under Royal Household Protocol. Margaret read it 3 times. She understood what it meant. She understood who had been in that room. She sat with that understanding for about 24 hours before she decided she couldn't sit with it anymore. James Pemberton had been a Royal Protection Officer for 11 years. Before that, he'd been Metropolitan Police. Before that, he'd grown up in Wolverhampton in a house where his father worked double shifts at a factory, and his mother kept every birthday card anyone had ever sent her in a shoebox under the bed. He was not a man who'd arrived at palace service through the usual routes. No elite school connections. No inherited deference to titles. He'd earned his way up through sheer quiet competence and a temperament that registered somewhere between unflappable and carved from something geological. He was 41. He had a slight scar above his left eyebrow from a different life. His colleagues described him as reliable in the way they describe a load-bearing wall. His assignment on the evening in question had been a standard late shift on the residential floors. Nothing unusual. He'd done it 100 times. What he hadn't done, in 11 years, was encounter this particular situation. He'd been at his post at the end of the East Corridor, the north end, 40 feet from the door marked with a small brass plaque reading Conservation Storage E7, when he'd heard the door. At 9:11, he'd looked up. He recognized her immediately. Of course he did. Queen Camilla moved through the corridor without staff accompaniment, which was unusual, and without the kind of forward notice that typically preceded any royal movement on restricted floors. She was wearing what looked like a dark coat over night clothes. She had a key card in her hand. She stopped when she saw him. He straightened without meaning to. It was reflex, 11 years of reflex. "Good evening, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite file anywhere. Not imperious, not flustered, something between the two. Determined was closer. Like someone who had argued with themselves all the way down the corridor and won. "Good evening." She moved toward E7. He stayed where he was. She paused, key card raised. "You'll need to log your access through the Conservation Office for any restricted storage rooms after hours, ma'am. Protocol requires." "I'm aware of the protocol," she said, not sharply. Matter of fact, like she was aware of all the protocols and had decided this was a night where awareness and compliance were different things. She used the key card. He watched the door open. This was the moment. 11 years of training laid out a very clear picture of what the right thing to do was. The right thing was to note the access, log it, report it through standard channels, allow the override to proceed given the clearance level attached to that card, and follow up in writing the next morning. The right thing was institutional. Procedural. Safe. He watched her disappear into the room. He stood in the corridor for about 40 seconds. Then, he followed her. She was standing in the center of the room when he entered. The lights were on their lowest setting. The conservation storage didn't have standard overhead illumination, just soft lateral panels along the lower walls that were designed not to stress the textiles. In that light, the room looked nothing like a storage facility. It looked like something else. Something between a chapel and a place people go when they can't sleep. The dress was in its case. He'd never seen it before, not up close. He'd passed this corridor 1,000 times and never thought much about what was behind the door. Now he looked at it, through the glass of the preservation case, under the low light, and felt something shift unexpectedly in his chest. It was enormous. That was the first thing. You forgot, somehow, that it would be enormous. The train spread behind it like a frozen wave. The seed pearls caught even the conservation lighting and held it in a way that made the whole garment look faintly luminous. Queen Camilla was standing 3 feet from the case with her hands clasped in front of her, and she was not moving. She was just looking at it. James stood near the door and said nothing. A minute passed, maybe 2. Then, he said, "Ma'am, I need to ask you to log this access." She didn't turn around. "I need to ask you to leave," he said. She turned then. Not angry. Something else. Something that made his carefully maintained professional composure have to work a little harder. "Officer Pemberton, ma'am." "Officer Pemberton." She looked at him with something he could only describe, internally and never out loud, as the expression of someone who was very tired of having to explain themselves to people who had no context. I am not here to cause harm to anything in this room. I understand, ma'am. That's not. She was my mother-in-law. The words were quiet. She said them without performance, without pleading, without the particular emotional weight people put on sentences they want you to feel. She said them the way you say a thing that is simply, inconveniently, completely true. I am not a visitor here. I am not. I understand the protocols. I know this room has rules. I'm not here to break anything. He looked at her. She looked at him. The dress sat in its case between them and said nothing. Ma'am, he said, and then stopped. There was a version of this moment where he stepped back, where he let procedure be procedure and waited outside the door and wrote up the log and handed the whole situation to someone 3 pay grades above him to sort out. He knew that version. He'd been standing in it for the last 4 minutes. Ma'am, he said again, and this time it came out differently. Not a formal address. Something less tidy. The environmental settings were overridden. The temperature in this room is currently 3 degrees above the conservation baseline. I need you to step outside while I reset the controls. She stared at him. He held her gaze. He was 41 years old, the son of a man who worked double shifts, and he had never in his life raised his voice at a member of the royal family. He would not do it tonight. But there was a version of not raising your voice that is still, undeniably, the loudest thing in the room. I need you to step outside, ma'am. She stepped outside. She was waiting in the corridor when he came out. He'd reset the climate controls, logged the access manually on his own device with a full timestamp and his badge number, left the room exactly as he'd found it except for 3 degrees. He closed the door behind him. She was leaning against the wall opposite, arms folded, still in her dark coat, and in the low corridor lighting, she looked not like a queen or a public figure or any of the things the cameras and the newspapers and the institutional language turned her into. She looked like a woman in a corridor at 9:30 at night who hadn't been sleeping well. He'd seen that look on people before. He knew what it came from. I'll need to file an incident report, he said. I know. The conservation team will be notified of the access and the climate variance. I know that too. He stood. She stood. The corridor was very quiet. She wore it once, Camilla said. Not to him specifically. To the door, maybe. To the dark at the end of the corridor. 76 years ago. One day. One morning of her life. And it's been in that room ever since. James said nothing. I kept thinking about that. This last year, particularly. She stopped. Recalibrated something. There's so much that was hers that were meant to. There are protocols for everything. What gets preserved and how and who touches it and when. And I understand why. I do understand why. A pause. But sometimes I just wanted to see it. He thought of his mother's shoebox under the bed. Every birthday card anyone had ever sent her, rubber-banded in chronological order, some of them 30 years old. He thought about what that meant. What it costs to be a person who keeps things. You could have requested a supervised viewing, he said. Through the conservation office. She looked at him. He looked back. Something passed between them that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite grief, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both. Yes, she said. I could have. Would you have? The pause before she answered was the answer. He nodded once. The report will reflect that access was made using valid royal household clearance and that conservation protocols were restored promptly. He kept his voice even. Professional. The careful architecture of his job. The temperature variance will be noted. The duration of access will be logged. She watched him. What it won't include, he said, is anything I'm not required to include. She was very still for a moment. Officer Pemberton. Ma'am, you raised your voice at me. He thought about it. I spoke firmly, ma'am. In the interest of the collection's preservation. Something moved across her face that might, under different circumstances, in a different life, have been the beginning of a smile. Yes, she said. I suppose you did. She straightened, pulled her coat around her, became, in the span of about 3 seconds, the person the institution expected her to be, not because she was performing it, he thought, but because that was the gear she shifted into when the private moment was over and the corridor continued. Thank you, she said. He nodded. She walked away. He stood at his post and watched the empty corridor and thought about a dress that had been worn once, in 1947, by a 21-year-old who had no idea yet what her life would ask of her. He thought about what it means to preserve something, whether preservation and love were different things, whether the protocols understood the difference. The corridor lights hummed. He wrote up his report. He filed it exactly as he'd said he would, complete, accurate, and precisely as long as it needed to be. He did not include everything. Some things he'd learned in 19 years of standing in other people's significant moments belonged to the corridor, to the low light, to the space between what happened and what gets recorded. The dress stayed in its room at 61 degrees. The seed pearls held their light. The corridor went back to being a corridor,